My name is Béatrice Jahanbin, and I'm an educator at the National Gallery of Canada. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which the gallery is situated is on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Welcome to our Spotlight Tour, The Artist as a Modern Woman, which will allow you to discover 3 female artists who contributed to the modernity of Canadian art at the turn of the 20th century. When Florence Carlyle, Mabel May, and Prudence Heward started out in the art world, many institutions did not accept women or offer them the same educational opportunities as men. A career as a professional artist was considered unacceptable for a woman by society then. By becoming professional artists, Carlyle, May, and Heward chose to live in a self-determined way. All 3 pushed back the limits imposed on women and women artists at the turn of the 20th century, and can be considered, each in their own way, models of the modern woman. Each artist is represented by one of her works chosen from the museum's permanent collection. Let's start with Grey and Gold by Florence Carlyle. Painted around 1910, this portrait represents Miss Maybe of Simcoe, Ontario. Carlyle specialized in female portraits, often taking friends and family members as models. At first glance, this painting seems typical of traditional female portraiture. Portraiture and genre painting were often considered appropriate subjects for female artists, since they could be done inside the home and therefore did not conflict with Victorian social mores of domesticity and femininity. But let us examine the work carefully. In the composition, Miss Maybe is shown in profile, leaning on a dark wooden sideboard loaded with serving dishes. We can infer that the scene is set in a dining room or kitchen, a place that illustrates the artist's commitment to painting scenes depicting the women of her day in the domestic sphere. But then, why does she represent a young woman reading? Notice that the ribbon-shaped bookmark, partly hidden by the model's left wrist, draws our attention to the thin volume on the sideboard between her arms. Like many of her contemporaries, Carlyle is sensitive to the issue of female emancipation. By depicting Miss Maybe absorbed in her reading, the artist demonstrates that at the turn of the 20th century, many women were no longer content with a settled life at home, but rather developed ambitions beyond the domestic sphere. In this case, perhaps a literary ambition. And Miss Maybe's dress seems more suited for an outing than for quietly reading at home. Note also the treatment of light and paint, especially in her upswept hair, the semi-transparent draping of the dress, and the dishes. Carlyle demonstrates here her knowledge of modernist styles and techniques, including Impressionism, which she studied in France in the late 1800s and continued to explore over the next 6 years. Moreover, the title, Grey and Gold, indicates that this portrait is primarily a study of color harmonies, testifying to the artist's awareness of the aesthetic movement, whose followers adopted a restricted palette of colors to create subtle tonal harmonies. The British artist James McNeill Whistler, who thought that painting could be compared to music, said, "The artist is born to pick and choose and group with science these elements, that the result may be beautiful, as the musician gathers his notes and forms his chords until he brings forth from chaos glorious harmony." Thanks to her perseverance, Florence Carlyle became not only a professional artist, but also the first woman to be elected an associate member of the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts, as well as a member of the Ontario Society of Artists. At the turn of the 20th century, winter, and especially the idealized representation of winter in the countryside, had long been a recurring theme in Quebec painting. The winter climate became a symbol of Canadian identity, and snow, part of a pictorial vocabulary that permeated the collective imagination. But the artist Henrietta Mabel May, Henry for those close to her, was more interested in the urban landscape as it was becoming substantially transformed by the growing industrialization than in the snowy landscapes of the Quebec countryside. In Street Scene Montreal, painted around 1914, May has placed in the foreground, to the right, elements that seem typical of a traditional genre scene. A brightly colored sleigh being pulled by a horse, old houses, a woman, perhaps a maid, dressed in old-fashioned clothes with a long white apron, and a man with what looks like a wooden shovel in his right hand. But the artist also added, on either side of the street, telephone poles, symbols of the new technologies that now allowed people to transcend time and space. And in the background, monumental grain elevators, imposing idols of industrialization. At the end of the 19th century, the Port of Montreal became the hub of the North American grain trade. The new transcontinental railway and canal system ensured the reliable and rapid transportation of grain from Western Canada. The port equipped itself accordingly. It is in this context that, at the very beginning of the 20th century, the port's grain elevators were built, of which the artist has shown a few examples in her painting to situate the scene. It is also important to note that May seeks to highlight the impressionist principles she experimented with in France to convey the textures and nuances of the snow, the smoke that partly blurs the silhouette of the buildings in the background, and the clouds in the sky. The work was noticed at its February exhibition in Toronto during the second annual small painting exhibition in the same year it was painted. May's professional career took off when she became a member of the Royal Canadian Academy of Arts in 1916 and when the National Gallery of Canada purchased some of her paintings, including this one. Dominating the space of the painting, a young woman sits on a hill in front of a rural landscape, observing us with a rather intense gaze. She does not smile. The 1928 composition of Girl on a Hill is characteristic of the figures, a term that Prudence Heward preferred to portrait, painted by the artist, and is far from the stereotypes of female portraiture prevalent at the end of the 19th century. In the wake of feminist claims about the place and role of women in society, Heward offered the public a type of femininity different from the norm, the new woman, complex, free, and independent. With her boyish hairstyle, athletic body, and direct gaze, Montreal dancer Louise McLeay is the embodiment of this new woman. McLeay may have chosen modern dance because it considered individual expression to be much more important than the rigid forms taught by dance academies. In a touch of realism that would have probably been shocking at the time, the dancer's dirty feet indicate that she most often performed barefoot on stage for greater freedom of movement. In its composition and choice of subject matter, Girl on a Hill is also a symbolic portrait of a modern artist who sought to free herself from the patriarchal shackles limiting her creativity. Like a number of the women artists in the Beaver Hall group with which she was associated, Heward helped revitalize figure painting. The gender parity in the group, formed in 1920, was a first in Canada, and this no doubt explains the attraction for the artist. The history of art has long been almost exclusively a masculine one. I hope that this brief overview of Canadian women artists at the turn of the 20th century indicates that women's important contribution to the world of painting in particular, and the arts in general, is beginning to emerge from the obscurity in which it has been left for too long.